Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Swainson, and I'm a trustee of Litfest. And Litfest, together with the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and the Department of History, inaugurated the first Lancaster History Lecture last year. It was given by Sathnam Sanghera and based on his book, Empire World. This year, we're very, very glad to welcome Helen Castor, author of The Eagle and the Heart. I won't say any more about her now because the moderator for the evening, Sophie-Thérèse Ambler, will do a proper introduction. But there's just a couple of things that I need to say. The first is this lecture series, which also includes the Environment Lecture and the Lancaster International Fiction Lecture, has been made possible because it is a 50-50 collaboration between Litfest and the university. And that big thanks on this go to Delphine Grass, who has been involved in the project from the beginning, and to Ed Simpson, Executive Dean of FAS, who I'll hand over to in a second. The other thing I need to say is that Litfest is in the same way that we collaborate on this project, we are natural collaborators with anyone who's got good ideas for things literary, storytelling, workshops, co-creation, projects in schools, and so on. And we're able to do it because we are funded by a whole range of organizations. Litfest is a charity, so it's a not-for-profit, and basically its aim is to spend every penny it earns and every penny it raises on its aims, which are to encourage the enjoyment of literature, ideas, history, the environment, and particularly reading, and particularly amongst children. And I won't say any more about that, except that we get our support from Lancaster City Council, who have supported Litfest since 1978, this year from Lancashire County Council, and for the adult part of the programme from Arts Council England. And all our other sponsors and supporters you will find on the sponsor board at the bookshop outside. And I will have more to say about the bookshop at the end. But for now, I'd like to hand over to Ed Simpson to introduce the evening.
Thank you, Bill. I'm here to welcome you all to the university. My name's Edward Simpson, and I'm the dean of one of the faculties here, and I represent arts, humanities, and social sciences. For those of you who read newspapers or are exposed to any kind of news whatsoever, you'll realize that universities are having something of a tough time at the moment, not least the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And I think of it as an important part of my role to represent those disciplines in the public sphere, to encourage this sort of participation, this kind of partnership between Litfest and the university, where the university plays a role in the region where we live and where the university is located, but also as a way of showing the public worth of the scholarship that my colleagues are engaged in, the sorts of contributions that arts, humanities, and social sciences make to the world. And I was hoping there might be some younger people in the room, but I'm going to say what I was... Hello, younger person. Thank you. I'm going to say, well, maybe it's just for you, but I don't think so. I'm often asked by parents about the value of studying disciplines within our faculty, forced in some ways to reply in economic terms to that argument, to that question. But a lot of what arts, humanities, and social science disciplines do is difficult to quantify. Teach you how to think, to be critical, to put individual lives in the perspective of broader social movements, in this case to think about time, transition, and the way we've become how we are. I think these are really important skills that take us far beyond the classroom and far beyond the sort of degree classifications and what the average graduate earning is. However, there are some professional associations, such as the British Academy, who specialise in countering arguments about the role of sciences in the world. and have come up with arguments about the economic value of shape disciplines, as they call them, which are arts, social sciences, and humanities. And there are some interesting things about the employability of graduates from FAS, and that is that immediate graduate earnings might be lower if you study those disciplines, but by the time you're mid-career, if you can think that far ahead, then usually your degree, your earnings bring you higher forms of income than if you'd studied science subjects. And if you look over the course of people's careers, the flexibility that our disciplines give in terms of shifting careers, in changing what you do, often bring more fulfilling, lifelong sorts of career trajectories to students who study our disciplines. So there is an economic argument as well as a moral and intellectual one underpinning the value of our disciplines. I'm not here to talk about that, really. I'm here to welcome you, to celebrate our partnership with Litfest, with Bill, to thank my colleague Delphine, who's sitting there, who does lots of this work on behalf of the university, to welcome you as an audience to this lecture, and to introduce my colleague, Dr. Sophie Ambler, who's going to moderate and introduce our speaker. So a warm welcome, and lovely to see so many people here.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sophie Ambler from the Department of History, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, a masterful and trailblazing historian who combines the best of rigorous historical research with the ability to ask big questions through history about power and what it means to be human, with the ability to write engagingly and movingly for a wide readership. Dr. Helen Castor. Helen's work will be familiar to many here, but I'll just pick out some of the highlights. She began her career with a research monograph on the Duchy of Lancaster, so this is in some ways a homecoming for her, before writing Blood and Roses, the story of the Paston family in the Wars of the Roses, which really for me was one of the books that showed how history can be written. She then wrote She-Wolves, the story of the women who reigned before Elizabeth, before a biography of Joan of Arc, which is set reading here at Lancaster on our 1415 and its aftermath module for our first year undergraduate historians. She then went on to write a short biography of Elizabeth I with the Penguin Monarch series, and now, of course, has written a dual biography on the tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV. So we're delighted to welcome her here this evening. The format will be that Helen will deliver our lecture, and then we will have a brief changeover where I will ask a few questions of Helen, and then there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. So please be thinking of questions and have them on hand when we come to that moment in the evening, and we'll have microphones for you to ask, and we'll also have those of us joining online as well. So without further ado, please welcome Helen Castor.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you to everyone for being here. I am honoured and delighted to be giving this lecture this evening. It's on the subject of my most recent book, The Tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV. Richard II and Henry IV were first cousins, born in 1367, just 3 months apart. They were 10 years old when Richard became King of England. They were 32 when, in 1399, Henry overthrew him to become king in his place. It was a shocking and intensely dangerous moment. To understand why, what was at stake, and why the attempt to depose a king might threaten the security of the whole kingdom, we need to understand what the job of a medieval king was, where his authority came from, what he was required to do with it, and how his commands were enforced. In other words, we need to understand the late medieval constitution, meaning, in the words of a recent essay by Christine Carpenter and Andrew Spencer, the set of political, governmental, and legal structures and shared values within which the business of everyday politics and governance operate. And I want to use the answers to those questions to tell the story of what went wrong with Richard's rule, and to explain why the attempt to set things right was itself both a terrifying process and a damaging one. It's a story about what happens when a ruler demands loyalty to himself as an individual rather than duty to the established constitution, when he seeks to create his own reality rather than concede the force of verifiable truths, when he demands that his own will should trump the force of law, when he recognizes no interests other than his own. It's a story about the unpredictability of unfolding political crises and about the ways in which authority can be bent, shaped, and broken. And its themes of power, legitimacy, and the limits of rule and resistance are as urgent now as they have ever been. All those who claim sovereign power, whatever the time or place, seek legitimation from somewhere. In medieval England, the source of the Crown's authority was clear. The king was appointed by God to rule the kingdom and its people. His right to rule came with profound responsibilities, the most fundamental of which was shown on the most iconic image of power most of England's people would ever have the chance to see: the King's Great Seal, the physical manifestation of the Crown's authority by which royal commands were authenticated. These are the two sides of Richard's seal, but every king from the Conqueror onwards used almost identical versions of these two images. On one side of the seal, the king sat in state, orb and sceptre in his hands, to give law and justice to his subjects. On the other, he rode a war horse, his sword unsheathed to defend his kingdom. As both judge and warrior, his task was to protect the realm from internal anarchy and from external attack. But the king was only one man. However all-encompassing his authority might be in theory, how did he govern in practical fact? 14th century England was a remarkably centralised state, with a complex bureaucracy, a sophisticated judicial system, and representative parliaments in which taxes were granted and statute law made. But it had no police force or standing army. For the enforcement of his rule, the king relied instead on the private power of the aristocracy, the great landowners whose estates gave them not only wealth, but control over the people who lived and worked on their land. So why should the great landowners, with political and military muscle directly at their command, obey the king? They were rich and powerful men who wanted more wealth and power for themselves and their dynasties, but not, crucially, at the expense of the wealth and power that they already had. They had everything to lose if the kingdom collapsed into anarchy or surrendered to foreign invasion, and everything to gain by upholding the hierarchy within which their own power was set, of which the crown formed the keystone. This was pragmatism, but pragmatism that couldn't be separated from deeply held belief. If the authority of the king was instituted by God, then to depose him was to risk everything, worldly security and immortal soul, by challenging the order of God's creation. Such devastatingly radical action could never be justified unless kingship turned into tyranny, rule by arbitrary will rather than law, threatening the interests of kingdom and people rather than defending them. But even then, could anyone except God rightfully remove a sovereign he had anointed? When Richard and Henry were born in 1367, that question had been answered in the affirmative only once in England in the 3 centuries since their ancestor, William the Conqueror, won his crown on the battlefield at Hastings. During the early decades of the 14th century, their great-grandfather, Edward II, had prioritised his favourites over the needs of his kingdom so consistently, to such appalling effect, that he undermined the rule of his own law. His wife led the resistance that in 1327 put his teenage son on the throne in his place. Since then, that new king, and here he is in his old age, had become one of the most extraordinary monarchs England had ever seen. Over the course of 40 years and counting, Richard and Henry's grandfather, Edward III, had shown how powerful a king of England could be if he understood his responsibilities. His pursuit of war with France both reached for glory in asserting his claim, inherited through his mother, to be King of France as well as King of England, and defended England's shores by pushing the fight deep into French territory. And there was a great deal to show in return for the dreadful costs of war. There were victories in battle and territorial and diplomatic gains won by a king who offered decisive, responsive leadership at home as well as in the field. It's not an accident that this is an illuminated initial from a book of statutes compiled in the 15th century. Certainly, his people believed that their fearsome and magnificent sovereign had most tenderly at heart his land of England, as his chancellor told a parliament held 8 months before Richard's birth. Edward III had shown just how powerful a king of England could be. But a structure of power which vested God-given authority in one man depended on that man to offer at least a bare minimum of leadership. And by the 1370s, that leadership was faltering. Edward was aging and ailing. His eldest son, the Black Prince, was also seriously unwell. After the English triumphs of the 1340s and 1350s and an ill-starred attempt at peace in the 1360s, the new phase of the war was going badly, and the king's next oldest son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, trying desperately to hold the regime together in the name of his father and brother, became a lightning rod for political blame. In 1376, the Black Prince died, followed a year later by his father, and England had to face a stark new reality. Edward III had ruled for half a century. Almost no one could remember a time when the crown had been worn by anyone else. But now it would come to rest on the head of a 10-year-old boy, the Black Prince's only legitimate child, Richard. In one sense, the hereditary principle had done its work. There was no argument over the succession. The people of England transferred their loyalty without question to the new King Richard II as the true heir apparent of the realm. But the true heir was 10. A way would have to be found to keep government going without him until he was old enough to take charge. In theory, the obvious answer was that John of Gaunt should serve as regent, as the king's oldest surviving uncle and the kingdom's most powerful magnate. But in practice, Gaunt was too unpopular, not only blamed for military failure and high taxation, but unfairly suspected of wanting to make himself king in his nephew's place. At the same time, he was too powerful for anyone else to be installed as regent over his head. The only workable solution was to fudge the issue. Officially, there would be no minority. The 10-year-old king would rule. Unofficially, decisions taken in the king's name would be made by his nobles. A young man growing to adulthood who understood the responsibilities as well as the rights of his crown might have come to understand why misrepresenting reality in that way was necessary and what he had to do to take command when the time came. But Richard was not that young man. For as long as he could remember, Richard had known that he was special. As the one true heir of his father and grandfather, he was unique and irreplaceable. But he had never seen kingship in action, because for as long as he could remember, his father and grandfather had been too ill to lead England's government. In their attempt to unite the country, Gaunt and the other lords trying to keep the war effort going had presented Richard to Parliament in January 1377 as a boy sent by his grandfather in the same manner as the scripture says, "Here is my beloved son, here is he who is wished for by all men." Seasoned politicians might recognise overblown rhetoric, but Richard heard the message that he was England's Messiah. When Edward III died that summer, the new little king was anointed and crowned in Westminster Abbey, an intoxicating ceremony that reinforced his growing sense of his own majesty. This is a life-size painting Richard commissioned later for display in the choir of the Abbey. It shows him as an adult, but I think it gives us some sense of his view of the effects of that sacred rite. And 4 years after that, during the chaos and violence of the Peasants' Revolt, Richard found that Wat Tyler's rebels were looking to him for leadership. They stood, they said, with King Richard and the true Commons against what they saw as a corrupt and failing government. 14-year-old Richard agreed. The government carried out in his name he believed was corrupt and failing. But his conclusion was not that he must learn to rule his people well. As he grew older, his obsession with the rights of his crown wasn't matched by any understanding of its duties. He had no interest in the challenging substance of government, in fighting to defend his kingdom, in the hard work of negotiating peace, or in the importance of law and justice. Instead, what had gone wrong in England, he thought, was that his nobles had usurped his God-given authority. The decades-long conflict with France was now going so badly that the treasury was empty, England's territories on the continent were falling to the French, and the south coast was repeatedly damaged by French raids. The war was no longer happening over there. It had come home to roost. But to Richard, it was a tedious irrelevance. Instead, in 1384 and 1385, while Gaunt tried to defend the north against the Scots and find terms for peace with the French, Richard and his favourites within the royal household were plotting unsuccessfully to murder him. In 1386, with Gaunt by now fighting abroad, a parliament led by Richard's youngest uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, tried to force the 19-year-old king to focus on the imminent threat of invasion by a French armada. Richard's furious response was that he would ask for help against Parliament's insolence from his cousin, the French king, and rather submit ourselves to him than succumb to our own subjects. It was a shocking demonstration that Richard had grown into a thin-skinned narcissist whose understanding of power was focused entirely on his own will rather than the needs of his people. Not only was the king failing to defend his kingdom from the coming attack, but at this of all possible moments, he was choosing to suggest that his subjects were his enemy and England's enemy his friend. Thomas of Woodstock's response was terse. If the king would not accept good advice, then good advice must be imposed on him in the form of a council appointed by Parliament for a year to oversee every aspect of the royal administration. It wasn't simple to impose restrictions on the king, but needs must. And given the extremity of Richard's response to those who had tried to make him recognise reality, the council's work continued, even when the French armada was thwarted by the weather. It had to be hoped that the young king might learn his lesson by the time the council's year in office was done. Instead, Richard upped the ante. He refused to cooperate with the council, removing himself from Westminster and declaring that all those who had supported the council, who had supported the council's appointment in Parliament, all of them should be punished as traitors. Treason was the worst of all crimes, carrying the worst of all punishments, a hideous death for the traitor himself, and the destruction of his line through the permanent forfeiture of his estates. For that reason, it had been closely defined by Edward III in a statute of 1352. But Richard was now taking the definition of treason entirely into his own hands. Anyone who forced or incited the king to do something against his will, he said, should be punished as a traitor. And who could determine if the king had done something against his will, apart from the king himself? When Richard returned to London in November 1387, his lords faced a frightening choice: submit in the fragile hope that the king could be persuaded into greater wisdom, or arm themselves against him in the attempt to force him back into line. Most kept their heads down, but 3 noblemen, the king's uncle Thomas of Woodstock and the Earls of Arundel and Warwick, chose resistance. They were trying, they said, to remove the favourites around the king who were the real traitors to the realm. This deflection of blame from Richard himself was a desperate attempt to protect themselves from charges of treason, but it also reflected the fact that Richard had no son or brother, no unquestioned heir, and it was impossible, therefore, to agree whether or how any of his uncles or cousins might replace him. But no deflection could avert the confrontation that was coming. And when it became clear that negotiation couldn't work because Richard's word couldn't be trusted, 2 younger lords joined Woodstock, Arundel and Warwick in rebellion. Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham, and Richard's cousin, Gaunt's son Henry of Bolingbroke. Henry led the forces that defeated Richard's favourite, Robert de Vere, at the Battle of Radcot Bridge and drove de Vere into exile. In 1388, at what became known as the Merciless Parliament, Henry and his allies charged Richard's closest advisers with treason and presided over a spate of executions. They were playing a profoundly dangerous game. Richard had sought to rewrite the law of treason, and with it the entire basis of the relationship between his crown, his subjects, and his law. But it was the rebel lords, in trying to stop him, who had first put an army into the field and held show trials leading to the gallows and the block. For now, Richard had no choice but to comply. But if a lasting peace were to be restored, some way would have to be found to draw a line under the conflict. In 1389, Richard made his move, reclaiming his place at the head of normal royal government with the help of the newly returned and always dutiful Gaunt. While he slowly rebuilt his regime, his cousin Henry took the chance to seek adventure and to put some distance between himself and the king by fighting in Lithuania with the crusading order of Teutonic Knights and travelling as a glamorous pilgrim through the courts of Europe to Jerusalem. Richard, meanwhile, was seeking to free himself from the financial and political constraints that had forced him to submit to his subjects' control. A permanent peace with France couldn't be found, but a 28-year truce sealed in 1396 by Richard's glittering wedding to Isabella, the 6-year-old daughter of the French king, called a halt to the war and filled Richard's treasury with gold from the little girl's dowry. He adopted a new badge, the White Hart. This one is from the exquisite altarpiece that we know as the Wilton diptych. And this one, if you can see it, just up there in that arch, a white hart on a golden background, is in Westminster Abbey, in the gallery above Poets' Corner, perfectly placed to catch the light from the windows and to be seen from the holy places near the high altar and the confessor's shrine. It was a badge that would also be worn by slightly bored-looking angels in the Wilton diptych, by Richard himself, and by people, a new retinue of knights and archers who answered only to Richard's personal authority. In theory, a king could call on the service of all his people. The unnerving question raised by this private army, therefore, was why Richard thought he needed it and what he intended to do with it. The lesson he'd learned, it turned out, was not the one his subjects had hoped. In 1397, he launched a terrifying coup within his own kingdom. Woodstock, Arundel and Warwick were arrested and charged with treason for their actions 10 years earlier, actions for which the pardons they'd received were not, in Richard's brave new world, worth the parchment on which they were written. Warwick was sentenced to life imprisonment. Arundel was beheaded on Tower Hill. And Woodstock, son of Edward III, the king's own uncle, was murdered behind the walls of his Calais prison. Their junior partners of 10 years before, Henry and Mowbray, were untouched so far, but found themselves in an appallingly compromised position. In the attempt to save themselves, they'd been complicit in the destruction of Woodstock, Arundel and Warwick. But Richard had already gone back on his words so many times that they were terrified of what might follow. While Richard tightened his grip on England through military force and judicial insecurity, fear drove Henry and Mowbray to accuse one another of treachery. Richard decreed that the truth should be tried by combat. But when the two men came face to face in the lists at Coventry in 1398, the king stopped the duel and banished them both from England. England was through the looking glass. 3 of the kingdom's greatest nobles had already been destroyed. Now 2 more were banished without being tried or convicted of any offence. No royal judgment, no royal pardon, no royal promise, it seemed, could ever be trusted. Richard declared that Henry and Mowbray in exile would be allowed to take possession of any lands they might inherit back in England. But once again, Richard lied. When Gaunt died in February 1399, the king took the vast estates of Henry's Duchy of Lancaster into his own possession. And then, believing he'd destroyed the power of the cousin he hated, Richard sailed with his army for Ireland, where he'd already enjoyed watching the Irish chiefs kneel in homage before him a few years earlier. But Richard didn't realise that in disinheriting Henry, what he'd destroyed was the foundation of his own rule. If the greatest nobleman in England couldn't rely on the protection of the law against the king's arbitrary will, then no one could. Richard had demonstrated in the clearest possible terms that there could be no security for any of his subjects while he still wore the crown. And if the king no longer offered his subjects security, if, in fact, he actively threatened it, then the constitution, the structures and shared values that allowed government to function, was broken. England's people looked for rescue to Henry, the Eagle Duke, as one poet called him after a badge his father and grandfather had used. The one man, after all the deaths of the previous 2 years, who could offer leadership in resistance to the king's new world order. When Henry returned from exile with a small band of loyal followers to claim his inheritance, he said, England rallied to his banner. By the time Richard managed to return from Ireland, his kingdom was already lost. It was a matter of practical necessity that Richard must be removed from the throne. It was a matter of practical fact that Henry was the only possible candidate to rule in his place. But still, removing the crown from an anointed king and putting it on another head was no simple task. If the keystone fell, would the hierarchy of the state collapse with it? 33 articles of accusation against Richard were drafted to justify his deposition. They returned again and again to his perjury In breaking the oath he had sworn at his coronation to uphold the law and do justice within his own realm. Instead, he declared, they said, that his laws were in his own mouth, and that the lives and property of his people were his and subject to his will. Even so, if a king was made by God, by what earthly authority could he be unmade? Richard, it was decided, must abdicate as well as being deposed. He tried to resist, but the outcome was brutally clear. He had no alternative. On the 29th of September 1399, Richard resigned the throne, and on the 13th of October, Henry was crowned King Henry IV in Westminster Abbey. But the one attribute of sovereignty Henry lacked was the one Richard still had: birthright. A king who had become a tyrant was replaced by a king who was a usurper, and that meant Henry's throne would always be vulnerable. Just how vulnerable became obvious less than 3 months later, when the handful of nobles who'd been closest to Richard rose in revolt. The rebellion was put down, but the danger of a living ex-king was clear. Within weeks, it was announced that Richard had died in his prison, starved to death, rumour said. In order to save England from Richard's tyranny, Henry had not only done what his cousin had always feared, usurped his power, but he'd committed the sin of regicide. A man who believed in justice and in the sacred authority of kingship had been forced to violate both in his attempt to preserve the kingdom. Henry would spend his reign trying to escape Richard's shadow, in the hope that his own good government might one day demonstrate God's blessing and justify his claim to England's throne. He never quite succeeded. His usurpation made him vulnerable. Anyone who felt dissatisfied with his rule could and did use the questionable legitimacy of his crown as justification for rebellion. It wasn't until 1408, after years of firefighting against internal revolt and external attacks by the Scots and the French, that England finally found an unsteady peace. By then, Henry's health had collapsed. His enemies were quick to see his suffering as evidence of God's judgment. And when he died at the age of just 45, this is the alabaster effigy that his widow commissioned to be placed on his tomb in Canterbury Cathedral. His son, Henry V, one of the most able men ever to wear the English crown, who sought to present himself as the rightful heir of both Henry and Richard, had to face one more conspiracy before the last embers of the conflagration of 1399 were finally extinguished. From a distance of 600 years, we can see what happened in 1399. Richard's attempt to reject the crown's duties to its subjects, or, in his view, to seize the power he believed was rightfully his, ultimately failed. His fall served to strengthen precedents that bound the king to uphold the law and defend the interests of his people, and in turn became a powerful precedent itself. The events of Richard's reign were repeatedly cited by opponents of Charles I in the 1640s. But being able to see with hindsight what happened doesn't mean that it was inevitable, nor does it mean that it came without profound costs. Thanks to the 16th century worldview that we've inherited most powerfully through Shakespeare, Richard's deposition and Henry's usurpation are often framed as the root of civil war, the bloody conflict of the Wars of the Roses that ended only with the coming of the Tudors. But there is another framing, another question to be asked. What would have happened to England if Richard hadn't been removed? Like all of the past, the story of Richard II and Henry IV gives us not answers, but warnings. It warns us not to assume that political structures or norms are immutable or eternal, especially if those in power set out to break them, and that the attempt to save them might mean breaking more, with consequences that aren't easy to foresee. And it tells us that whenever truth, material reality, and history itself become politically contested terms, we should pay very close attention indeed. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Helen. And there's lots that I and everyone will want to ask. Let's begin with the challenges of writing this book. So, The Eagle in the Heart is a story about people as much as about power and its structures and how those intersect. And I'd like to ask about the challenge of writing biography and medieval biography. Famously, one of the great historians of late medieval England of yesteryear, K.B. Macfarlane, provocatively claimed it wasn't possible to write medieval biography because it's not possible to see the inner life of the subject as much as you can see the public life, and many of us wouldn't agree with that. But how far is it possible to get into the heads of Richard and Henry, and how do you approach that challenge?
It is a challenge. And in one sense, of course, the great K.B. Macfarlane is right. It's very, very hard to get behind the closed doors of a public life in the Middle Ages because we don't have private letters, we don't have diaries. I so wish we did. But I don't think I agree that we can't try and we can't make some progress in trying. I think the one thing we know for certain is that these were living, breathing, three-dimensional human beings. So if we end up with a picture of them that feels more like a 2D cardboard cutout, we've gone wrong somewhere. So we may not have the wealth of information that modern historians take for granted, but we can see what they did. And actually, I'm a great believer in reading people how power works and doesn't work. And that's one of the reasons I love medieval history, because the great institutional frameworks of power that we are used to now are not quite so overwhelmingly in our front of vision. It's a very personal manifestation of power if you look at medieval England. And the personal element of it is the other bit that I'm interested in. I'm interested in psychology and the nature of these individuals that wield power in various ways. So I was talking to someone else the other day and trying to explain that I'm not interested in kings and queens because they're kings and queens, but because they exercise power in this world that I'm interested in, and because we have more of a chance of investigating their individual psychology than we do for people lower down. There are lower down the social hierarchy, I should say. There are exceptions, of course. A very remarkable French peasant girl who, at 17, stepped onto the political stage, and that was the reason I wanted to write about her. The same kinds of reasons, psychology and power. And I'm going on to Elizabeth I next, a full-scale biography of Elizabeth, and she's a very good example of what we were just talking about that you can't always work out what people are thinking from what they say. I'm already deep in trying to think about how I'm going to write about Elizabeth, given that she always wore masks. You could be in the room with her and not know whether she meant what she said. So it's that fascinating process of piecing things together to get a picture of an individual in the political world that they inhabited.
And in this particular case, and in others with Richard and Henry, this isn't necessarily virgin territory in terms of biography. Whether it's medieval history or modern history, we write biographies where other historians have trodden before. And there may be something about telling the story for our time or a fresh take on events. What do you think the story of Henry and Richard has to tell us now? What was it that made you think, let's bring this to life in a new way?
Well, it's been a very, very interesting process. I've been working on Richard and Henry one way or another ever since I first wrote an undergraduate essay about them in 1987. So they've been in my mind for a very long time, and I've known I wanted to write about them. And as you say, I mean, we are all always standing on the shoulders of giants whenever we set out to write any kind of history. And I knew there was extraordinary work that had been done on both reigns. There are the Yale Monarchs series, volumes by Nigel Saul on Richard II and Chris Gibbon Wilson on Henry IV, and a huge range of other amazing work. What I wanted to do, and where I felt I could hope to offer what I hoped would be a new perspective, was in two ways. One was in putting them together, and as much as anything I was thinking about Shakespeare here, because I love the history plays. I particularly love Richard II, which I think is one of the most extraordinary pieces of poetry ever written. But of course, Henry appears in Richard II and in the Henry IV plays that his name's on. But while Richard stands absolutely in the spotlight, remarkably so, in Richard II, Henry Bolingbroke in that play is really his nemesis, but we don't see inside Henry's head. And then in the Henry IV plays, really it's Hal and Falstaff standing out front, and Henry's a bit of a grey man behind. And so I really wanted to put Henry alongside Richard, this extraordinary pairing that they're exactly the same age. I mean, if I'd done that in a novel, I suspect people would have been telling me it was way too implausible. So I started out wanting to do that, and also wanting it to be a narrative, because I wanted to stand as far as possible in their shoes, look through their eyes, with a sense of not knowing what was about to happen next, because for this kind of psychological portrait I'm interested in, I think I have to do that. I've sworn in my books now never to use the phrase, little did she know that, because if she didn't know that, I don't want to know it either in this moment. But then, as I began to write over, and particularly the last 5 or 6 years I've been working on this book, I hadn't really expected the contemporary resonances of what I was writing about to become quite so deafening and quite so alarming. Questions all over the place globally. I'm sure you can think of some about the rule of law, about what it means if we have narcissists in power, what it means if reality becomes contested, what it means. Yeah, one could go on. Anyway, it's been a very, very interesting and not altogether reassuring 5 years in which to write about a subject that I've been thinking about for 30 plus, and I hadn't quite seen this coming. Historians are often very, very grateful when contemporary resonances make their work in some sense relevant. I would give that up if I could change things, but here we are.
And can I pick up on that point about narrative? So one of the wonderful things about this book and about your others is that they carry you through from beginning to end, and you don't want to put it down. And there's an art to not just how to write from one sentence to the next, but structure. And in particular, you've really made narrative into an art. And often we say to students when they're writing essays, don't write narrative, write analysis. But actually the narrative is part of the argument. So narrative is important. So how did you go about weaving that story together and approaching that?
Yes, it's one of the things I love most and find most challenging about writing a book. In some sense, I mean, there's a certain sense in which, on the macro level, you almost start approaching it as though it's a screenplay or a drama. You look for the points where chapters might begin or end, and you look for a kind of architecture in that way. But what you're pointing at is something much bigger and deeper than simply how to make the story work as a piece of drama. It's how to make it work as history. And actually, you've just reminded me, that had been in my head ever since that first undergraduate essay I wrote, which wasn't actually terribly good, but I found absolutely fascinating. And it was because I hadn't sufficiently added chronology into my analysis, because of course we ask history students to look at the sum total of the evidence that's available to them and then analyse structurally. That's how academic analysis works. But in a reign like Richard's, where you can't understand what's going on in 1397 unless you've previously understood what's going on in 1387, and that those two things are inherently related but different, and they follow one chronologically on from the other, it became clear to me that absolutely it was an analytical, structural tool, that my narrative was going to unfold in that way. And then the deeper and deeper in I got, the more essential it became in this. I mean, I think in any of the subjects I'm writing about, because I'm trying to write about the human experience, none of us, I mean, this is a time when we're all being reminded from day to day and week to week, none of us know what's going to happen tomorrow. None of us know what the headlines are going to be in tomorrow's newspaper. And even though we have enormous amounts of information available to us, we still can't predict with any certainty. We're flying blind to some extent. So I'm trying to fly blind with my protagonists as they go through. And as I was writing, and my very brilliant editor at Allen Lane, Thomas Penn, is himself a wonderful historian and a narrative historian. And every time he sort of poked at a bit of my draft and said, something's not quite right here, it's not quite working, I would go back and look, and it would be a place where I'd ever so slightly messed with the chronology because it made my life easier narratively. And I would have to go back and unravel, unpick, work out why and how I'd done that, not do it, and stitch the narrative back together. And always it sorted out the problem. And if you've got patience for one more minute, it's still happening even after the book is out. So this is an exclusive addition to the book. I write in the book at one stage about Richard's tomb, which he commissioned himself after his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, died in 1394. And Richard being Richard, it was gold everywhere, enormously lavish, very, very beautiful. The first ever double tomb commissioned by a king of England, so that he could commission Anne's effigy and his own effigy lying beside it. And it also meant that he could write his own epitaph, because the tomb was finished before he fell in 1399. So you have this epitaph that Richard at the very least approved, if not actively wrote. And in this epitaph, he compares himself to Homer, and he says, and Richard, overcome by fate, is how he managed the fact of his not yet having happened death, had struck down the mighty and all those who violated the rights of his crown. I've slightly garbled that, but something along those lines. And I mention it in the book as a moment in which clearly we see the kind of grandiosity and the kind of, you know, in the book I'm hoping it's a kind of foreboding statement of intent of where he might be going. But I hadn't explained why he compared himself to Homer, because I couldn't work out why he had. I think I've now got a theory on that. But also, he hadn't yet struck down the proud and the mighty and all those who violated the rights of his crown. He'd had this very difficult moment in 86 to 88, and he'd come off worst. So I wrote a little thing about it, suggesting that perhaps it was related to calling himself Homer, because there's a saying, even Homer nods, that is becoming popular in the late 14th century, meaning Homer is the most expert with the best memory, and even he gets things wrong sometimes. So maybe he's saying, I remember, I'm going to sort you out. But it was only after that, and some people asked me some questions about it, and I then thought, well, no, the tomb is only finished in 1398, 1399. 1397, he has struck down the mighty and those who had violated the rights of his crown. I suspect that epitaph was a crowning moment of, finally I've done what I always wanted to do, and I'm going to put it on my tomb, and I'm going to... So it wasn't a warning, I think, now, but it was only sitting down with that chronology that, yes, the tomb was commissioned in 1395, and it says there's going to be an epitaph, but we don't know exactly when those words were put on, but I suspect it's post-1397, it's post-killing Woodstock and Arundel, and it's him saying, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair.
The ability to write one's own epitaph, every ruler's dream.
It is, but maybe the wish to do it is not is not a good sign for that ruler's fate, maybe.
Now, I'm sure many here and joining us online would have questions to ask, so I'd like to open up questions to the audience. We have microphones, so please raise your hand or draw attention to your question online, and I will point you out and direct a microphone. So who would like to... we have a question at the back, please, Thomas.
Hello. Can you hear? Oh, yeah, there we go. Yeah, thanks for the talk. It's really, really interesting. I was wondering, so if I remember correctly, 33 accusations were made against Richard in order to justify usurping him. And it made me sort of wonder, what's the kind of importance of justification when it comes to power from, I suppose, both like a societal perspective and also a psychological perspective?
Very good question, and hugely important, precisely because the king's job was so important, the king's role. Though the structure of authority in medieval England is top-down, God to the king then rules the people. The fact that a constitution has now developed, that he has these responsibilities, means that the risk of removing him and seeming to ride roughshod over the established principles and precedents is very, very real, particularly for someone who is acting, as Henry is in 1399, with the support of the political community, supposedly to protect those precedents and those principles. So if Henry simply steams in there and says, right, Richard's out, I'm in, where does that leave the Constitution and his relationship with his subjects? And it's very noticeable. I mean, the lengths they go to Henry and his advisors go to in 1399, very carefully drawn up articles of deposition, that a committee has been scouring chronicles and records and precedents, not only of Edward II in 1327, but Holy Roman Emperor's deposition, anything that they can scrape from the historical record that gives ballast to their claim. Plus, belt and braces, Richard will be made to abdicate, as Edward II had before him. And then, when that has all happened, Henry stands up in Parliament, or is it really a Parliament anymore, because if Richard's no longer king, and he called the Parliament, but it's certainly a gathering of the representatives of the realm, and Henry stands up and he claims the empty throne for himself. And what he says is very interesting. He claims it as someone descended through the right line of royal blood from Henry III, not Edward III, but the Lancastrian line going right back to Henry III, because the realm has been so badly governed, and because God has given it to him, basically. But he's been able to come back and save the realm. But he's not explicitly claiming by right of conquest, because that would mean he could rewrite all the laws from the beginning. He's not claiming explicitly by overwhelming legitimacy of royal blood, because there are other cousins who've got claims that are potentially at least as good as his. So he's, And Richard has been deposed, but he's also not saying acclamation of the Parliament gathered here, because that would then mean authority was coming from the Parliament to him. So it's a huge fudge, but it's a fudge to try and reinforce the norms that have been there before. And that really matters, because those norms are the ones that hold in place the rule of law and the principle that the king must do justice to his people. And so it's that kind of legitimacy is absolutely crucial. And if that starts getting lost, then quite where things will end up it becomes very, very hard to see. And that's what Henry is struggling with throughout his reign, and that's why 1413 is crucial, because he manages to hold on so that Henry V is the legitimate heir of the previous king. The previous king might be a usurper, but he's held on long enough to hand the crown over. And it's worth noting that in 1422, when Henry V dies unexpectedly very young, and his heir is a 9-month-old baby, there is not a whisper of resistance or rebellion or question. In other words, the Lancastrian dynasty has, by then, established its legitimacy without question. Thank you. Sorry, very long answer.
Questions?
I actually found that really interesting. And as somebody who's studying the Tudor and Stuart period in English history at the moment, how do you compare your Richard's actions, that of Charles I? Because if you think about it, two are kind of similar in the fact they started working against their own people, in a sense.
Or certainly many of their own people saw it that way. Exactly, yes. I should say at the outset, I am no expert in the 17th century at all, but it's a very good comparison on all sorts of levels. And one of the ones that intrigues me, actually, is in terms of the artistic legacy of those two kings, because if you had to pick two kings who were the best at commissioning art in sort of pre-modern history in England, those two would be right up there. Absolutely extraordinary aesthetic sensibility, not doing so well politically, as you're saying. I think it's a very interesting and revealing comparison. Obviously, the precedents have moved on by the 1640s, more layers added partly by the conflicts of the Wars of the Roses, partly by the Tudors and the Reformation. The importance of Parliament has enormously increased. But the principles are still there. It's the principles of the rule of law, of consultation with your people about the laws that you're imposing on them, particularly when they relate to the ability of the government to take property. Because if you think about it, taxation, it does come back to the rule of law. For the Crown to go in and take your money in taxes, that breaks the law unless they've got consent. So, there are really fundamental principles at stake in all of these issues, and what consultation and consent and what the legitimate structure of government should be. These are questions that are at the heart of both the late 14th century conflict and what's going on in the 1640s, which is why you see the nobles who are opposing Charles I in the 1640s, they are explicitly going back to read the deposition articles, sort of saying, right, what can we use here? It's explicitly part of the deliberations about how they should go about resisting what Charles is doing. So I'm sorry not to get into more detail about the 1640s. I suspect you're better placed to do that, but it's a very, very interesting point of comparison.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So a question at the back.
Hi, thank you very much. I had a question about the episcopate. You talk about Richard's sort of ideas of government and power and how it comes from God, and I was curious about how you interpret the actions or inactions of the episcopate during the 1380s and 90s as compared to their predecessors in 1327 with the deposition of Edward II and the interventions taken against Henry III, and how you contrast those different cohorts.
Okay, now I'm feeling worried again because Henry III and Edward II, I'm reaching back in my memories, and there are people who might be more expert than me to make that comparison. But the episcopate are clearly a crucial part of what's going on in the 1380s and 1390s, and particularly the figure of Thomas Arundel, as we call him, the Earl of Arundel's younger brother, who was Bishop of Ely in the 1380s and then becomes Archbishop of Canterbury by the time the conflict is playing out in the 1390s. And he's a very interesting figure in the 1380s conflict because he goes with Thomas of Woodstock to confront the king when the French are about to invade, to say, you must come and do something about this. You know, so he is part of that attempt to communicate with the king about his responsibilities, where Woodstock is clearly extremely angry, huge chip on his shoulder that he hasn't been more involved in leading government anyway. Thomas Arundel, Bishop Arundel, is much more of, he's trying to make this whole thing work, and you can see that in 1387 when Woodstock goes off into rebellion with Arundel and the Earl of Arundel and the Earl of Warwick, and Bishop Arundel stays with Richard, trying to keep the show on the road, trying to see if there's common ground to be found. And that's the position he keeps all the way through the 1390s to the point where Richard decides to take his revenge and decides to move against Woodstock, Arundel and Warwick. And the interesting thing in 1397 with Archbishop Arundel, who is a sort of key representative both of the episcopate, but also of a large number of the nobles who are trying to see if there is middle ground still to be stood on in the attempt to hold everything together. They go along with the arrest of Woodstock, Arundel and Warwick because the king says, I've discovered new treasons. But by the time Parliament actually sits to hear the cases, there are no new treasons. It's all about 10 years ago. And the next thing that Richard does is order Archbishop Arundel's arrest because he's trying to say, hang on, this is not what we said, and he's immediately exiled. So what you see with Richard, and I need to defer to other people to talk about the case of Edward II and Henry III, but what you see with Richard is Archbishop Arundel trying to lead the spiritual lords to find some common ground that might be able to hold this conflict from spinning too far out of control. And in 1397 it becomes clear that Richard can't and won't do it, and what he's been doing in the recent episcopal appointments in the mid-1390s, whenever a see becomes available, he's appointing clerics from within the royal household, men who are right close to him, who've probably never been to their sees. He's developing a household episcopate because he's all about developing a cadre of yes men who will allow him to do exactly what he wants.
So there's a broader question now, I suppose, about the role of religious figures in political life and who can speak the truth to power.
And that is what the bishops then go on, bishops and archbishops, led by Archbishop Arundel, go on to do with Henry IV. Because, of course, I mean, as always, Richard sucks up all the oxygen in the room. I realise I've set that up, but several, Archbishop Arundel leads them, but I'm thinking also of Philip Repington, who was the abbot of Leicester, who writes Henry, who, very close to Henry, writes him an excoriating letter a few years into his reign, basically saying, justice is lost, law is lost, what are you doing? You've got to sort this out or disaster is going to befall you too. And the difference being that Henry listens. Henry knows he's right. He's not going to be exiled or put in the tower or anything else. So, and Archbishop Arundel continues with that role as Henry's reign goes on.
We have a question online, I think, from the audience. So if we could have the microphone at the front, please.
Hi, this is from Mike, who's watching online. He wants to know a bit more about the women in the story, I think. He'd like to know what happened to Isabella and also who Henry married.
Very, very good question. This is a very male story as it happens, just in terms of, I've written a lot about women before who've become very active politically. this happens to be a story where, for various reasons, the women they're sort of in the wings rather than centre stage, but they're all fascinating. Richard originally first of all married Anne of Bohemia, the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, then married 6-year-old Isabella, and I'm so glad to have this question because it breaks my heart, the story of Isabella. 6, when she marries Richard and is handed over at this wedding summit that's like the Field of the Cloth of Gold, actually more or less on the same bit of land as the Field of the Cloth of Gold later will be. And there's this heartrending scene where she's handed over by her father, the Mad King of France, and the French nobles to the English, and she's weeping and she cries as she embraces her father and her uncle, and she's handed over to the English ladies, and I'm always so grateful that at that point the highest status English lady is John of Gaunt's third wife, Catherine Swynford, the mother of his formerly illegitimate children who are about to be legitimised, the Beauforts, and who had originally been in charge of the Lancastrian nursery and was a very, very intelligent, warm, able woman. I'm so glad that she was in charge of the ladies who took Isabella, because she was 6, being handed over, able to bring very, very few attendants with her. They packed dolls in with her trousseau of elaborately jewelled gowns. Richard seems to have treated her well. She was set up in a very lavish household, and the accounts of him going to say goodbye to her when he was off to Ireland was of great fondness, although he did also order that her French attendants should be sent back to France at that point. But it is clear that when Richard fell, Isabella was outraged and horrified, hated Henry, all dressed in mourning black, refusing to have anything to do with him. It was tricky because her dowry had been spent. The French were demanding that she be sent back along with her dowry. Henry had to negotiate in quite complicated terms because he didn't have the money. She was eventually sent back with a ceremony on the same spot, more or less, almost as lavish, although all in black, again, cost enormous amounts of money to send her back. So she did get to see her family again, and she'd said to the French ambassador it was her dearest wish to see her parents and her siblings again. She was the oldest of many, many children. She was then married off to her cousin, the heir to the Duke of Orleans, who was a few years younger than her. So having been married at 6 to a 29-year-old, she was then married at 14 to an 11-year-old. And then at 19, she became pregnant with their first child and died in childbirth. Henry, meanwhile, very quickly, because I know we don't have all the time in the world, Henry was married at 14 to a noble heiress called Mary de Bohun, co-heiress to several earldoms. And once they started living together, she was 12 at that point. Once she was old enough, when she got to 14, 15, and they started living together, a whole series of children came more or less year on year on year, 4 sons in a row and then 2 daughters. And Mary seems to have been a real homebody. She stayed at home in Peterborough, where they had a very sort of lovely domestic setup, and Henry would then go off gallivanting either to Westminster, depending what was happening, or when he went off around Europe. And when he went on his second trip round Europe, which ended up going to Jerusalem, he brought lots of presents home. He brought Mary a parrot from Italy, and he brought an ostrich from Prague, and he brought what's usually said to be a leopard, but I'm absolutely convinced it was a hunting cheetah, a trained cheetah that he'd been given by the King of Cyprus, which had to be transported in a special cabin on board ship and then a special carriage. And I just always try and think of Mary at home at Peterborough watching this baggage train trundle down the drive, thinking, what on earth has he done? But Mary, too, died in childbirth in her early 20s, having their last daughter. And Henry then, once he'd become king, married Joan of Navarre, who had been the widowed Duchess of Brittany, whom he had met several times during the 1390s. And she was the widow of a great duchy, but she didn't, and she brought great political skill with her, but it wasn't that he was acquiring enormous diplomatic advantage by marrying her. It really does seem to have been a meeting of minds as well as a sensible political match. Henry was an interesting and appealing character. I've been told off for being too fond of Henry on occasion. He does seem to have been a genuinely appealing character, and genuinely interested in women. He had two very, very formidable older sisters, which I think might have had something to do with it.
We're drawing towards the end of our time, so we may have a chance for one very brief question and answer, and then we'll move on to the next stage.
Yes, thank you so much. Very interesting. You mentioned the Beaufort. Did the nearly just about or newly legitimized Beaufort play a role in putting their half-sibling Henry Bolingbroke on the throne?
They did, although they were young and upcoming. I would say they were absolutely in Henry's camp the minute he landed, along with the whole of the Duchy of Lancaster. I mean, Henry landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire and then traced his path through the country via a chain of Lancastrian castles, gathering men towards him as he came. So they were very much part of that, but it's really in his reign that they come to the fore as major, major players in politics. Both his brother, John Beaufort, who becomes Earl of Somerset, or who was already Earl of Somerset, because John Beaufort, Richard had made attempts to kind of gather the Beauforts into the new world order that he was creating in the late 1390s, while Gaunt was still alive, and Gaunt, of course, was going along with everything he did. Gaunt, in an impossible position, had no choice but to go along with Henry's exile and had to believe that Henry would somehow be allowed to inherit and then come back. And John Beaufort, and in fact Thomas Beaufort, the youngest one, had been retained by Richard and sort of gathered into Richard's establishment. Henry Beaufort, the middle one, having gone into the church and who'd gone over to Ireland with Richard. So Richard had done everything he could to try and separate them from Henry, and had also taken young Hal, as Shakespeare shows him to us, Henry's youngest son, had taken him to Ireland with him as well. So Richard was really doing everything to isolate Henry Bolingbroke as much as he could, and to try to make sure that he had protection by keeping the rest of Henry's family close to him. None of it worked. None of it worked. And as soon as there is a chance to go to Henry, along with the rest of England's people, they make the move, despite the fact that Richard has given them favour. What is favour worth if it's not standing on solid ground? Richard has just shown that anything he gives can be taken away with a word, on a whim, with no justification. And that's why the great edifice of his rule turns out to be a house of cards. I mean, it was very... I can't claim to be any kind of expert at all in what I'm about to say, but to watch Assad's regime in Syria collapse overnight was very interesting by comparison with Richard's regime, that Richard clearly believed he had built up to a point of power that would be unassailable, and actually what he'd done was destroy it. Yeah.
I'm sure this has whetted your appetite for reading the enthralling tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV. And before we thank Helen, this is just a plug that we have a bookstall outside, so you can pick up your copy. You can have Helen sign it and put more questions to her there. So please do join us afterwards outside. But for now, please do join me in thanking Helen for an enthralling insight into this period. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Helen, for that terrific lecture, and thank you, Sophie, for bringing your expertise to the job of asking questions and moderating the Q&A. Before we go, there are just a couple of things to say. In addition to what Sophie said, for tonight only, you can buy this huge tome, fascinating and beautifully written for not the £35 that it normally sells for, but for a mere £30, and you don't have to pay Amazon postage, you can take it home with you. The two things to say are Litfest is not only constructed out of a series of partnerships and aims to provide a platform for all kinds of different sorts of events. So do please take the program that's on the desk in front of you home with you, because there's still a lot of really terrific things to come, including, for those with an interest in history, the Cotton Famine Poetry event on Sunday with Simon Rennie and Ruth Ann Wallbank, who have been researching the poetry that was written during the 1860s as a result of the cotton famine. And the other thing to say is that Litfest, its funding is a similar patchwork, but it's a dynamic one. So you imagine us as Wallace and Gromit at the end of the first Wallace and Gromit film, where we're laying the track that we're trying to travel on into the future. It's made up of things like Lancaster City Council's support. It's made up of contributions from our partners like Lancaster University. We get support from the Arts Council, but all of these things would be nothing without your own contributions. So please help us make the last 100 yards of track across the chasm and donate to Litfest on your way out. And we will be back again another year with another program of events. So it would be wrong to end without asking you to thank our speaker and moderator once more before you rush out to donate and to buy the book. Thank you.